Welcome to Talk Cosmos, the show where Sue Rose Minahan and guests unveil astrology's ancient archetypes that continually build the collective experiences in our unconsciousness. Get ready to find your free will from your roots in the stars.
Welcome. Tonight is June 8th. 2019, and the repeat program is Thursday in the morning at 6 o'clock on June 13th. And tonight's subject is, again, continuing with Gemini, twin mythologies. You know, twin mythologies abound throughout the globe because duality exists. Whether it's the solar sun and the lunar moon, every day we have dusk and dawn. Twice a year we have equinoxes of even light that immediately change, and then we have their solstice of extreme light. We experience it personally: love, hate, fear, courage, truth, dishonesty, creative and destruction, nature itself with high tides and low tides. So this manifestation, it exists through the spirit and the physical energies connected to our heart and mind. So these complicated yet very simple forces are the essential essences world round that confound us mortal minds. That's what I was thinking. To elaborate on this further, we will during the conversation. Tonight, I have a repeat guest, Wendy Wywrot, and she is here in Bellevue, Washington, and her website is Wywrot, that's WYWROT.com, or Loving Home Feng Shui. Wendy's an astrologer and archetypal, spiritual, shamanic, and traditional. She consults locally and internationally. She teaches and she studies mythology, Kabbalah, Hermetic philosophy, ancient history, and she travels to many sacred sites. She actually experiences firsthand what we want to contemplate. Her interests spanning, and not just interests, but certifications in Feng Shui, Reiki, hypnotherapy. She's an ordained minister, certified spiritual healer and counselor, shamanic ancestral healer, energetic healing. And in addition, Chinese 5-element face reading. There's actually a school here that one can go to that if one's interested in being a participant of a student so that students can read your face. Again, go to her website, and you can find that at talkcosmos.com. We have all the guests with the schedules and their bios and locations. I personally did and was most astounded. It related strongly to my astrological chart, so it's a comparative and very fascinating study. And on top of all that, Wendy also does custom flower essence blends. So tonight we are focusing on astrology and the twin mythologies. Hi, Wendy.
Hi, Sue. Thanks for having me.
Yes, it's always a pleasure, and I'm so glad you came up with this topic. It's one of my favorites of all. And I suppose starting off with Castor, the mortal, and Pollux, his twin brother. And, you know, we were both at NORWAC, which is Northwest Astrology Conference, and I mentioned that for those outside of Seattle area. It's every Memorial Day, hosted by Laura Nalbandian for 35 years now. It's a fascinating, wonderful, either 3 to 5 day event, depending on how you do it. And I heard Jason Hawley of Santa Fe, who's a psychologist and fascinating astrologer who weaves in these marvelous mythologies. Because there aren't too many. Lynn Bell does, who lives in Paris, and Jason does. And then I met a woman. Well, there's others that are interested in asteroids and the Plutonians like Alan Clay and on. But there's still a select few.
And Demetra George.
Yes, thank you, and Demetra. Yes, indeed. So at any rate, what he brought out, which I think was fascinating, because in that mythology, there's two sets of twins. There's the male ones that are Castor, the mortal, and Pollux, the immortal, who are undifferentiated, was the word he used. In other words, we link them connected at all times. It was only through Castor's inevitable death that, of course, is the crowning glory of the story, because from that they still are united through alternating experiences between spirit and matter, the underworld. But the other sisters were Helen of Troy, the great immortal, and her sister Clymnestra, Clymenstra, who is always differentiated. They're never together, which is a whole nother series. So
Yes.
these, because again and again, as I was reading this wonderful subject to try to learn a little bit more of this fascination, I too share with you that it's that they can be females, they can be twin brothers, whichever. It can be complementary or else evil forces, one versus evil versus good.
Mm-hmm.
But going back to the Gemini one, not to elaborate so much on Helen and Clymnestra, but just to realize that I think it's interesting that one set is always united as a unit and the others are totally separated.
Living in totally different cities, very far from one another, the two women.
Yes. With no connection ever that one had the other.
And the two brothers were very, very close and always together.
The one thought, though, was that Clymnestra, her downfall through the whole tragic part was, first of all, Helen is given credit for having started, whether it's good or bad, starting the Trojan War, which for mythology and for that whole study really was a dividing point. As Jason says, the ending of the hero world. And that's another factor to consider at some other point. But the reality is that this war was started and that has its own involvement. But Clymestra's husband wanted to go to Troy and be part of this.
Agamemnon.
Okay.
That's her husband.
And he couldn't get there because the winds weren't blowing. Although, as usual, there's always a price to pay if you want something. And that was he'd have to sacrifice his daughter, which he in his unfortunately limited brain would do, and killed his daughter.
And it was a trick because they told her that she was going to be married to Achilles. So she showed up in her bridal clothing.
Oh.
So sad. And then, her own father sacrificed her to the goddess Artemis to make the winds work for the ships to sail to Troy.
Yes. So in the long run, Clymnestra, because it always with these stories, there's these connections that go further. But with Clymnestra, she ends up being vengeful, having a lover, because it was such a long war. And besides, he was a no good Nick. No good Nick. That's something my grandmother would always say.
Too cute.
Yeah, I love that. Yep, no good Nick. And so it is a fascinating contemplation because somehow we harbor these aspects of choices. When you consider that's what the stories represent in their best
choices.
Business.
It all comes down to choices, right, Sue?
Yes.
In everything about our lives.
Alignment.
Yes.
Yeah, because here one could have just realized that he didn't have to go to Troy.
Right. Or figure a different way to get there.
Yeah.
Or a different way to please Artemis.
That's true, because the gods, when you consider that what do these gods represent, they represent that part of us that wants to connect with spirit, just like Castor and Pollux, needing to unite in some fashion. Although another aspect to follow through on that talk that really made a lot of sense to me was that in the twin factor, they're two separate entities, regardless. It's not just one. It's not like the opposite of the horse, and that's not quite opposite, where the horse and the man, the centaur, are one being. It's actually two different individuals. And so even though they're united all the time in their experiences, there's still all that theme of alternating, and finding your twin is such a strong dynamic, of completion, and yet also of, in some way, you could say differentiation, right?
Yes, yes. And it's interesting, the stories that Castor and Pollux were so close, such good buddies, went everywhere together, went on the Argos to do the Golden Fleece caper, and had all these adventures together. And then when Castor ended up dying, Pollux was just devastated. And so in like you were talking about, in one version of the story, he appeals to his father Zeus, and Zeus allows Castor to have eternal life as well, but they have to take turns each day, right? Living and not living. And I don't know if you've probably heard this other story, Sue, about Chiron.
I don't lead on. Yes.
So
please.
there's one story where Chiron, the very wise healer and teacher who taught many of the heroes such as Achilles and just about everybody, Asclepius, Jason, the list goes on.
And he was a centaur.
Yeah,
Yes.
he was a centaur, and he was the wisest of the centaurs. And Chiron had been wounded. Some say he was wounded.
Achilles' heel.
Yeah, some say he was wounded by a scratch from a poisoned arrow. Anyway, Chiron was in constant pain, and he is the archetype of the wounded healer who, even though he's in pain, he helps others no matter what. So Chiron was immortal, and so the story, in one of the stories about Castor and Pollux, Chiron gave his immortality to Castor so that the twins could be together forever, because Chiron wanted to leave his physical body and be out of pain and just die. And see, he gave that gift of immortality to Castor. So how interesting that that's one of the versions of the story.
It is because frequently I've also read that Chiron exchanged it with Prometheus, who had given his... Well, he had not given, he stole the fire, stole the fire back to give to humans.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore why was he being mistreated? Because his liver was being pecked out every day by an eagle.
Mm-hmm.
Was that in this sense of awe that this spiritual being of life needs to be remembered through the awe of life and the spiritual essence and connection that we have, not just taken for granted.
Absolutely.
So that's interesting. I hadn't heard about, but so that's a possibility too. Regardless, they did remain united.
Yes.
Because whether or not, because there's the variations throughout time that were really hand through mouth or mouth through oral history. The fact is, it's a constellation. Half the year is visible and half the year is not.
Oh,
so
yes.
It again accentuates that idea that there's the underworld. And yet, to experience the spirit is not the physical. So where is it? It's part of the death. It's part of the sky.
Mm-hmm.
It's what we can't access. So I think in their minds, this is how they convey these ideas. And for our minds, is we're sharing, it's such a vital part to access, that we're not just the atoms that are running around in our body. There's this mysterious force that connects people, that
the spirit, the soul, maybe the anima mundi, the world soul, connecting all of us together.
yes,
These great mysteries that we'll never get to the bottom of. I hope that after I die and I get my life review, there'll be some splaining to do, and I'm hoping they'll explain to me kind of what's going on. Or could it be that once we're on the other side, we're in our wiser self anyway, and we already know and understand why things are the way they are?
well, many questions
Yes.
and many reasons to keep looking. And perhaps some mythology here can give a little indication that because there are riddles. And in fact, of the many twins, which I'm sure you have a host of things I see to comment on. But I'll just mention that as I was researching some of my books, because the Native Indians also, and there are the two twins down in the Mayan culture, and many, and there's some down in Brazil. I mean, it repeats and repeats. It's hardly just the Greek, because again, of the duality that exists in our world, just the very essence of it. But one of the things that it was mentioning is that in the very beginning, as far as the Indian legends, that animals and humans spoke the same language.
Oh, isn't that
so
lovely?
When we speak of our passing or whatever, I think that language is there is symbolism, and there is a depth of comprehension that of perceiving things, is that through living we even recognize more and more. So how we perceive things isn't always just as we might see it on the surface, and that's really what these stories share. But it was, and just to conclude that, was that unfortunately humans chose to enslave and ask the animals to do the things that they naturally were doing, like give them food, but forced them to do that, and then robbed the animals of their winter stores, so that eventually the animals said, "No, we're not talking your language anymore."
Oh, wow.
So it's interesting, but they haven't even a word for animals or people. The phrases mean the beings that are world over, all living, a description encompassing humans as well as animals and even rocks, which,
I love that.
again, yes, all the animation, because of it's just stilled motion. It isn't dead motion, which goes back to the idea that Gaia could even be of living. Well, when it comes to, and I didn't want to go on, I want to hear what you have here. But since I brought up the Mayans,
Oh,
those
yes.
two,
Tell us.
well, of those two twins, again, it seems to replicate some of the ideas earlier of that they were born through a mental condition, that the mother was talking to their father was killed by the baddies, which happened to be the death gods. But the difference is that eventually and they were mischievous, these two. They did a lot of trickery, which in some ways is how do you find your strength? It's through choosing somebody's weaknesses, their blind spots, which is one way of looking at trickery, maybe.
What are these twins called? Their
boy,
names?
they're fancy names.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they're.
Oh, that's okay then.
And I have it down. It was the one page that didn't print, but I'll pull it up because I have it on my laptop here. But the point is that through all, they eventually win by a game, and it was a game that has to do with a ball. And a lot of in the Southwest, like in Arizona, there's I've seen big circles where the ancients they're no longer. It was people left there mysteriously somewhere around, I'm not sure when, but it was early on, like before, I don't know if it was before the Europeans came or not, but at any rate, but they were games where they'd have games, and down in Mexico too, and there's this ball, I think they use it with their feet back and forth. You've seen it? Possibly. But the point is that they ended up in this game killing the death people, because progressively these twins became able to defy death.
Oh, okay.
And I think really what it comes down to is this, whether it's a sense of loss or whether the sense of connecting on another essence of looking at immortality in the sense of spiritual connection, the spirituality of the self that makes so that things like revenge, like Clemesta, isn't a choice, that somehow the life and death process goes on. Anyway, their names were Huna, Huna, Pu, P-U, and Zbalanque, which is Zbalanque. Not easy to pronounce.
Fascinating. Are they two boys,
Yeah,
two
two
girls?
boys, two
Two
boys,
boys.
yeah.
Okay. Wow. Interesting.
But this whole, and then from that is the jaguar sun and the jaguar deer.
Ooh.
So all of the jaguar, of course, is an enormous totem for everything from Mexico down through Central America. And I don't know about, I know Central America too. And then the deer is also for a lot of the native Indians all throughout Latin America and through Southwest America. But that's not with the twins right now, so we won't. But it is fascinating. So, but it was this idea of death, once again, that the twins exemplified, that their capacity to, I don't know about cheating death, but transforming it.
Or transcending it, maybe?
Yes, beautiful. Thank you, Wendy.
Oh, sure.
So I'm...
Just like Castor and Pollux.
Yes.
Well, that's wonderful. Okay. I love seeing these same themes reflected over and over again from in different countries.
In some of yours, what were you thinking? Like, what were...
Oh, gosh. Well, one of the things I'd like to share is that and I don't know if you covered this in your other Gemini radio shows,
so.
but in Egyptian times, the symbol of Gemini was a pair of a woman and a man twins holding hands.
Oh, now would that be Nut? And I did read about that. That was fascinating. There's two that were called, Nut and Geb, the earth.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, Geb.
Nut, the sky, and Geb, the earth god.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
which is just the opposite of what the Greeks often put, because they're twins, Apollo and Artemis, where Apollo is...
sun.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
and Artemis is the hunter.
The moon,
the
hunter.
huntress.
Mm-hmm.
So, but here Nut, if I'm saying her name right, was a barrier, protecting the earth, a body of sky and touching the four corners, and separating chaos and making order. That was one just little thing I read about it,
that.
Isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's another theme that is so important when, we live here in an organized world. Well, it's supposed to be. We have calendars, but really living just within the sun and the moon that gets up and sets and the flooding rivers. Chaos would be, and the instincts would always be at your door.
Yeah, in the ancient times, it was a lot scarier time because they didn't have the kind of technology we have now. I mean, it's starting to be a scary time here again with all the increased hurricane activity and storms.
Unpredictable.
Yeah, exactly. Unpredictable. But yeah, in the ancient times, I mean, outside of your city was viewed as like an extremely scary place where chaos reigned and where anything could happen.
Yes.
And,
So with this, now,
yes.
Did you have further to say about this Egyptian, or just the fact that it was a male and a female?
I have more to say.
Oh, good.
Sure. I would like to share that in the Sanskrit tradition, the Gemini constellation also was a male and a female, and it was called the Lovers.
Oh.
And that might be why, I don't remember if I'm right about this or not, but sometimes I think the Lovers tarot card
I was just thinking
is
of
Gemini, which I always wondered
heard.
why, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yes, I've that rings a bell often, because it is that connection. And we in our world think of lovers on one terms, but really thinking of love, and we have so few words. We have amorous and affection and whatnot, but love as a capacity of depth is inextricable with life. Often on esoteric, which means hidden, or those in this world, it is where love is the factor that unites everything, and that Exactly.
Like in very primal astrology, they say that Eros, the love, is what created everything and unites everything.
Yes. And going back, there's been a few talks. I'm doing 3 all. Next week will be the next one on the Kabbalah letters.
Ooh.
And interestingly, for Aries and Taurus, especially Taurus, it brought that because Vav, it's such a step-by-step logical way, if you really just, when it's deciphered, that it connects the great unknown of everything to the physical.
Ooh.
Through this interaction, which is constant, the giving and receiving part.
Ooh.
Yes, which is love, and it's sexual and it's fertile and it's not to be divided away from that.
Oh, absolutely. And I would love to share that. So some of the time Romans viewed the Gemini twins as Castor and Pollux, but sometimes they viewed them as Apollo and Diana, Artemis, the sun god and moon goddess. And then the Babylonians named them Mastabagalgal, which meant twins of indefinite gender.
Oh.
Isn't that interesting? And the Persians and Greeks just called them twins. And so some people believe that male twin heroic stories, like the stories of Castor and Pollux, are patriarchal revisions of earlier stories in which the pair was androgynous, or there was a woman and a man, or a girl and a boy. And so in the older, more pre-patriarchal myths, sometimes the god and goddess were twins.
Again, this goes back to very, very ancient thoughts, because we really have adapted what the Greeks told the Romans. The Romans
Exactly.
just took that, shifted a few names, and then that's what we realized. But there was this legacy ahead of that.
Rich legacy,
Yes, and some of it is with the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Hebrew, which goes into the Kabbalah.
Yes.
Because there's many forms of text. And the Sufi, well, that was later probably.
And the Haranian Sabians, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and also the Chaldeans.
Oh, boy. Well, we will return in just a moment. We're going to remember these. And this is with Wendy Wywrot and Sue Rose Minahan, June 8th, Twin Mythologies on KKNW. Talk Cosmos. While we take a break from this week's edition of Talk Cosmos, let's take a look at this cycle's archetype. We are currently in the period of Gemini. By leaving a cycle based on physical form, integrated through spirit, the energy of Gemini connects spirit with matter, focused on communicating and defining the external. Gemini is a mutable air sign signifying flexibility. Gemini dually focuses upon teaching and learning in order to synthesize the world one lives within.
This is Dawn Glinsky from 6 O'Clock Astrology, and you're listening to Talk Cosmos on Alternative Talk 1150 AM, where we discuss the meaningfulness of our roots in the stars.
Be sure to support the sponsors of your favorite shows on Alternative Talk 1150.
Hello again. We're back. This is Sue Rose Minahan, Talk Cosmos. You can find us at talkcosmos.com. And it's on 1150 KKNW. There's online or in Seattle on the radio and an app. And I'm speaking with Wendy Wywrot. That's WYWROT.com. In fact, if you look for her, and she's here in Bellevue. And we're talking about Gemini mythology. And we just brought up a host of ancient references from the Chaldean to the Babylonian, and about the androgynous beginnings, really, of this whole energy. If This reminds me, if you look back, because this is the third sign, Gemini is in the first quarter. There's 12 signs, and it goes Aries, Taurus, Gemini, and Aries is a spark. It's that life force, fire energy, directed outward, breaking, separating from the womb, from the whole.
The seed
Becoming.
bursting out, the little green shoot bursting out of the seed in the springtime.
Yes.
Very Aries.
Yes. And then the spirit comes into the vessel and forms that birth. But, we often kind of just lop those together. Okay, we've got one, now we've finished with that, and we're doing the next. But really, they're interacting all the time.
Mm-hmm. Like a progression.
Yes, like a dynamic that's igniting life. And I'm thinking that, Taurus is to survive, to maintain that life that got started, that little seed that you brought up.
Mm-hmm.
And so in Gemini, again, it's about survival. All of this is about, ideally, the continuation and more development. And they're interacting between, things, there's an ending to my neighborhood, there's an ending to my life, but yet there's a re-beginning again. And I think that gets back to these ancient ideas that you've been looking at, and I have too. And I'd love to hear again of this androgynous idea of, because Ningish Zeta, which I was mentioning, the Sumerian, that's back in Babylonian, 5,500 years ago, plus right about that time,
Mm-hmm.
an early god that had many of the Gemini qualities, but also the messenger to because Mercury does, is a messenger to Hades, can go,
Mm-hmm.
the one messenger and God that can go down to the dead
Mm-hmm.
without being changed.
And can guide the souls of the dead.
Exactly. Or give messages and that.
Yes.
So he had his caduceus, and that was the original caduceus. I don't know if the original, but the earliest one that I've noted
Mm-hmm.
in my own limitation, which I progressively, who knows, I might discover more, but it was the tree of life, which is a branch from the tree of life, which is, and the two serpents wrapped around it, the female and the male heads looking at each other.
What a beautiful image. And in Hindu medical body theory, I don't know how to state it, but those can represent the Ida and the Pingala, which are light energy channels that come up on either side of the central channel, and then one of them ends up in the eyes, right eye, one of them ends up in the left eye.
Oh.
And they, you can, in medical astrology, you can see, like, if someone's right eye is being bothered, they usually said that it might be that the sun was having a problem. And if their left eye is being bothered, maybe there's a transiting planet afflicting their moon. And I think the eyes are reversed for male and females, so that when people gaze into each other's eyes as they're falling in love. But then there's some of us where our eyes are switched. And I think that's so maybe instead of the right eye being the solar eye, the left eye is the moon, is the solar eye. So it's just fun food for thought.
No, I've loved this because my grandfather was an artist, and only way I've known him is to look at some of his paintings and drawings. So I've always looked at the eyes. He did a lot of people. I mean, he was born in 1890 or something, so he was an artist during the 20s and 30s and 40s and all. But the eyes are crucial for our soul, that recognition. And I always knew that. I thought just automatically one represented feminine or the other masculine, which would be solar lunar.
Yes.
But the fact that they can switch and they're opposite is very, I think, authentic. So that's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and since we were talking about the Trojan War earlier, I would just like to share with everybody that there's a book called Why Homer Matters, and it's a really fun book to read, all about stories about all the different people that researched Troy, including excavating Troy, including different people that translated the Iliad. And I just would like to highly recommend that book, Why Homer Matters.
I have written that down. I have those books, and they're big. A little help would be just very fine. Yeah.
Oh, were we going to talk about the androgyne?
Yes, please. I'm waiting.
Oh, okay. So in many primal, super ancient mythologies, the creator of a world was a primal androgyne, which was a combined male-female deity. It was sometimes represented as a male and a woman embracing, which you can see reflected in the Hindu mythology with Shiva and Shakti statues embracing, creating the world. Sometimes it was a one being that had a female half on the left side and a male half on the right side. And also in some mythologies, Hermes and Aphrodite were united in a deity called Hermaphroditus. And in Jewish mystical tradition, sometimes they viewed the original Jehovah as an androgyne, with the male part being Yod, J-O-D, or Y-O-D, and then the female part being the pre-Hebraic name, which was Eve or Hava or Hawa, and those combined together to make the name Jehovah.
Well, they do, actually, from what I've, Yud and Hey, because there's 4 letters in that name, which actually people have conspired to say Jehovah, but that's only because if you say those consonants, it kind of sounds like that, I detect. It's not really because it was ever declared as such.
Right.
But there's 4 letters, but 3 that are only the same, and it's Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey.
Yes.
Because I learned this with my work with Dana Bernbach, who will be next week. And so the idea, I love that you brought it up again, because I think this conceptual thought that the whole, if we live in a fragmented world, meaning that this egg burst, or whether or the patriarch think it was an explosion or if it was an egg bursting, both of which will let be, and the whole became many parts. What was the whole? The whole had to be both. The pole had to be male, female.
Had to be united,
Yeah.
right?
And that's what the Yud is. It's up above, which is the all, the absolute. There's part, which these letters have these spiritual meanings. And the Hey is one of receiving. But when it's connected, then it gives the womb, and it presents the birth. It's all very, and that's just in a snapshot that's without a lot of extra depth. But I'm supporting what you're saying.
Oh, yes. Isn't it interesting? Sometimes Jewish Gnostics would believe that Eve and Adam were androgynously combined. So she was not like just his rib born from his side, but long ago Adam was united with Eve, like their bodies were together. And so there's a quote from, I believe, Joseph Campbell: "When Eve was still in Adam, death did not exist. When she was separated from him, death came into being. If he again becomes complete and attains his former self, death will be no more. A second Adam would appear, which would be called the hermaphrodite."
I've read too, along with that study, that because words change. There's a joke where everybody lays on the belly or not, maybe that's a different joke. But anyway, where you do laughter and everybody laughs and eventually everybody's laughing. But on this one, you whisper a word, and by the time it goes around, little kids do this, it's a totally different word.
Telephone.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
So here it's where in the ancient Aramaic, not in
okay,
the
the
text,
language that Jesus spoke,
yes,
Aramaic.
back in the days of the birth of all of this, it meant side, not rib.
Oh, isn't that fascinating?
So it was one of the side. So it
Ooh,
goes
I love
back to
that.
this twin thought of multiplicity and of
Dualism and separation.
yes, the parts. and in some
Wow.
ways that might be differentiated or not. But here, because it takes two to tango, you might say,
Yes.
to replicate, at least in the world that we live in, without too much artificial intelligence, we, we still need the male and the female of whether it's a bird or whether it's a flower.
Right. We need yin and yang together, and they're constantly changing into one another and cooperating and building, creating, and destroying.
Although
and we
I-
need all of it.
Although I have to discount myself because there are sea anemones that I think just separate. But we
Like
really,
hydras. You
yeah,
mean
but maybe we don't really
parthenogenesis?
understand those two. I'm still listening. Go ahead.
Oh my gosh,
Thank you.
that just reminds me that there's a snake that had some baby snakes just through parthenogenesis. Like there were only female snakes in this zoo, and there's a snake that recently gave birth to some snakes. I can't remember if might be a boa, and I can't remember if she lays eggs or has live snakes. Can't remember.
Without any male. Just
Right.
suddenly.
A virgin birth from a snake. And you know what? That's a really good omen that the goddess might be coming back to our planet, because in the ancient times, the bird and the snake were very sacred to the goddess. So,
Yes.
I mean, even though there's the story of Adam and Eve and the snake in the garden, there's other ways of looking at
Oh,
it.
absolutely.
Yes, where
And again, when it comes to the snake, it has a skin that it sheds. The serpent, the snake, the dragon, all of these symbols are representative of life itself and the
Yes.
metamorphosis that people go through. So it really is just like being scared of a spider jumping up Little Miss Muffet on top of the chair. I used to be scared of spiders, but not any longer. You know, you have to take force. You know, did you happen? I'm looking at some of my notes here too, and please continue with what you have. But I'm in a moment. But about Romulus and Remus.
Oh, now how fascinating is that? That is another pair that the Romans sometimes thought were in the constellation Gemini. The founders of Rome, and they were foster sons of a she-wolf.
Well, it is, according to the story, I was looking a little history because it is fascinating. Aeneas, who I think comes from Troy.
Yes. And he
Over
was the
to
son of
Italy.
Venus.
And he, long story short, before the twins were born, their mother was forced to become, or to become a Vestal Virgin, which at that time, at the first time the Vestal Virgins were to protect this sacred flame, which is representative too of life. But at one time they actually, on a very pure sense, would help alleviate the warriors' pain and agony through consummating love. But by the time the Romans got a hold of it, it was strictly just nothing to do with that. And the point is that if they had any relationship at all, they were killed. Now, they weren't property because they weren't married, so there were some benefits. Well, it's hard to look at the whole picture.
They had more rights than the average woman in Rome.
Exactly.
Yes.
So this woman, Rhea Silvia, had these twins because, for various reasons, either Hermes or somebody came and impregnated her, or else she was raped. We don't know. But the point is that, or maybe Mars.
Yeah,
So
could be.
they threw the twins off to sea because the brother, it's involved with the story, but he didn't want to have blood on his hands. It's amazing what somehow the consensus of the people affect some of these stories, the way they think, because he didn't do it because it was the wrong thing to do. He was doing it because others would see him as such a baddie. No good, Nick. So at any rate, And that's where the wolves come and suckle them. And there have been feral children that have been documented, but it also then this old couple come and find the little ones. So I kind of wonder if maybe, I've always wondered, because the wolf also has quite a legacy of as a totem. And it is also where, what is the story actually telling us? They're telling us that the appetite for freedom, expression of strong instincts, and or feeling threatened. So the best side of it is they have strong instincts. The worst side is that they have fear of being threatened, which is storyline goes over and over again. I mean, okay, so that they were adopted by this old couple, and then they take off, and one gets captured by that same king, and the king ends up getting killed, and then they go and they find Rome, but then they're jealous. One brother's jealous of the other, and so one gets killed. And then the one that leads them on continues the war, and then eventually the Senate gets tired of his shenanigans, and he dies.
Oh, wow.
But it isn't a peaceful by any means. But again, it seems to be like the wolf. Sharp intelligence, deep connection with your instincts, wanting freedom. They wanted their own city, and expresses those instincts, but also feeling threatened.
Oh, yes. That clash and jealousy between the twins.
So in some ways, I don't know if there's any reconciliation that I've seen with those two twins. And it's never determined whether they're really myth or real. There's, again, like the language of the animals, it gets throughout time so closely united. But it seems like we're living somewhat a legacy of this whole divorce that happened since the Grecian times, where the instinct got put aside in favor of the intellect, which had its purpose, but now we're in a time of integrating. And as you had said, this male-female force that is essentially the real spirit, to connect to it to such a way of realizing that it doesn't have to be so divided as we're thinking, okay, that's just Aries and this is just Taurus, and now we can understand these parts, but like food, we're going to put them together and cook up a sauce.
Yes.
Chow down.
Yes, absolutely. Cooperation between the yin and yang, and hopefully more and more men are respecting women, and more women are speaking up and coming into
and
their
respecting
own.
Men.
Yeah. And we hope we hope everyone can respect everyone, because the patriarchy disempowers men and women.
Yes.
The patriarchy tells little boys it's not okay to cry.
Yes.
And you have to be tough, and all that stuff is very painful for little boys to grow up that way. So I have a lot of compassion for little boys and little girls, and hopefully as we evolve, we're honoring our intuitive side more and more, and respecting and seeing that there is a good place for the intellect and the intuition.
I agree. So we still have a few minutes here, and I'd be glad to hear some other possible references or researches that you may have.
Oh, one of the things I noticed, read in one of my mythology books, is the fact that one of the reasons we have these myths about human and divine twins is that since twins weren't common, there was the consideration that they were uncanny. People felt superstitious about twins because it was so unusual, and sometimes they were viewed as ill-omened, and other times they were viewed as fortunate. And so often ancient peoples would assume that one of the twins was a child of divine origin, which happened not only with Castor and Pollux and Helen and Clytemnestra, but also with Hercules and Iphicles. Hercules had a mortal brother.
I didn't know this.
I didn't either until I was reading up on it. And what else about twins?
Yes?
Did
it go into anything about... It sort of rings a bell about... Was this, in a sense, do you think, to make Hercules of his divinity in separation, like that differentiation idea? That it could be... Because I know, come to think of it, in the ancients, when you consider the Kabbalah essence, it's unable to define what the God essence is. Just use that word liberally here, but one can say what it isn't.
Right.
So possibly having a twin, one could say, well, this person is divine, that one is not. In other words, it is just kind of a contrast.
Oh, it could be. And a lot of the Hercules myths are very patriarchal. And so the main myth I was able to find about Hercules and Iphicles is that when they were little, two snakes came to their cradle, and Iphicles screamed in terror, but Hercules took a snake in each hand and crushed and killed them as a baby. Yes,
That's famous. And really, it shows the power of integration, which I think essentially is always the message, integrating these forces of whether it's our emotions and our body or whether it's our spirit and our matter, because there's strength to be shared. And by fearing this unknown, the chaos or the what we don't understand, is just it needs the other strength. I'm eager, but I'll just mention, we have a moment here to say that next week on the 15th, I'll be concluding the Gemini archetype, and Dana Bernbach will return for a third time. We'll pause after that. So it'll be the end of a little mini series that we have, and it'll be on the Kabbalah letter Zayin, Zayin. I think it's the 7th letter, but it refers to motion, which of course relates to Gemini, and we will divulge more how that is. You can also find archives or the talks on Podcast One. It's a new feature through 1150 KKNW, the radio AM talk station that this program is viewed through, and it's really exciting. And you can go to talkcosmos.com just to check out the whole schedule. You can find Wendy there at wywrot.com. Or if you can't remember that and don't have anything to write it down, just go to talkcosmos.com and click on any of the menu items or the actual events. They all pop up with pictures and all kinds of goodies. So Wendy and I have a few minutes. Yes.
Oh, well, I found another few famous twins.
Oh, good.
In Celtic mythology, there's a goddess named Arian Road, and I believe it means silver wheel. It means the silver wheel of the sky, the Milky Way. And she had twins that were dark and light. Dylan was the dark twin, and Luch was the light twin. And that
ties it all together, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Rod, yes. I've heard of this goddess quite a bit, and the Celts. The Celtic, when one goes into research, really covered Europe for a long, long time.
Oh my gosh, there were so many more places than people realize.
Yes,
I mean,
all the way down to Italy.
Yes, Italy, Germany,
the Baltics, I think,
yes,
over
and
there.
Ukraine.
Yeah,
just all over. A huge influence. I think. Very.
It was only when the Romans came and they pushed them all up. There was all of that time that now we think of it really up around the Ireland and the Welsh and all of that.
Yes.
More.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, so when you speak of these, it's like a chicken and egg, which is first.
Mm-hmm.
It's so ancient. So I love that, light and dark. That seems very primitive, very essential.
And in Zoroastrian, Ahura Mazda and Ahriman were twins, and they were God and the devil, the good force and the evil force. In American Indians, said the white Manitou or the Lord of Life was twins with the black Manitah or Manitou or Lord of Death. They were born simultaneously from the womb of the mother goddess, called the old woman who never dies, considered the real ruler of gods and men.
It goes back and forth, doesn't it, as far as the creation idea of the feminine and the masculine, and then the unity of the both of them. And there's so many different connections, and really Gemini is connections. That's a huge part of it. You know, it's actually the sextile too in astrology, 60 degrees. It connects things back and forth. Wendy, it has been absolutely fabulous. You're such a treat. This is Talk Cosmos with Wendy Wywrot and Sue Rose Minahan.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. Well, we will visit again. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for listening to Talk Cosmos, the show where Sue Rose Minahan and guests unveil astrology's ancient archetypes that continually build the collective experiences in our unconsciousness. Be sure to tune in next Saturday at 6 p.m. to continue finding your roots in the stars.